Welcome to everyone who has joined the call and to those who will be following later via the recording. My name is Zora Artis and I'm the IABC Asia Pacific Vice Chair, and I'm also on the IABC International Executive Board as a Director through till June. I'm here with Gabrielle Dolan. Now, Gabrielle Dolan is our special guest today, and she is a member of IABC, but she's also quite a well-known and renowned thought leader in business storytelling, amongst other things. And I had the privilege of doing one of Gabrielle's storytelling workshops a number of years ago, and I found it invaluable, and I recommend it to anyone to do if they have the opportunity. So we're lucky enough today to have Gabrielle talking to us about how to use personal stories to connect and engage with employees. Now, I'm going to hand over to Gabrielle shortly, and Gabrielle will take control of the webinar from the perspective of taking us through her expertise, and you are very welcome to ask questions at any time through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, or you can ask us questions in the chat, and Gabrielle will take the time to answer that. We'll be finishing the session just before 60 minutes is up, but in the meantime I'm going to hand over to Gabrielle, so thank you.
Thanks, Zora. And yes, I will leave lots of time at the end for questions, but if you've got a question as we're going through, certainly just yell out or put it in the chat and I will respond. So I'll just get my picture of my face off the screen. So storytelling in business. So I had the pleasure of working. I used to work at National Australia Bank about 15 years ago, and I had some pretty senior leadership roles there. And it was while I was working at NAB that I guess I discovered the power of storytelling. I remember working quite distinctly, it was a bit of a sliding doors moment, and I remember working with this woman called Merrin. And Merrin just shared a random story with me once about a flight she was on. And this particular flight, Merrin was a frequent traveller, so she never really listened to, the safety instructions or asleep or, reading the paper or anything like that, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with if you travel a lot. But anyway, this one particular flight, due to really bad weather, they had to abort the landing, and they circled around again, and the weather had got progressively worse, so they had to abort a second time. And on the third attempt to land, the captain came over the speaker and just said that before we land, we'll go through the safety instructions one more time. And with that, Merrin told me people were like asking questions and looking for the life jacket and actually counting the rows to the exit and like full on undivided attention. And it was a few months later that we were rolling out a major program across NAB. It was a major change project that was going to impact all of the HR people. Merrin was the project manager and I was the change manager. So part of my role as a change manager, I always try to think about, when you're doing a presentation, what's the one or two key messages that you want to get across? So I asked Merrin what that was, and she said, really, the only thing I want them to understand from this meeting is that they're going to be receiving lots of information about this change, that it may not always be relevant to them, but they need to be paying attention because at some point it's going to impact them. It's going to impact them personally. So I recommended Merrin share that story about the flight she was on, and her initial reaction was a little bit of, what the hell's that got to do with anything? But I convinced her that it was on message. And it was the first time I sat back and observed the power of someone sharing a personal story to get their business message across. And not only the impact it had immediately on the people in the room, but 3 months, 6 months, 12 months later, people were still referring to that story. And, like I said at the start, I didn't realize it at the time, but it was a bit of a sliding doors moment, because what I noticed is that the really inspiring leaders that I wanted to work for were sharing stories. I'd go to conferences and you'd hear speaker after speaker, and the really great speakers that you thought, wow, they were really good, what they were doing is they were sharing stories. So I left NAB 15 years ago to teach business leaders how to share stories, how to share personal stories to get their message across in a way that people connect and engage with. So 15 years ago, it certainly, storytelling in business wasn't a thing. People laughed at me a lot, what I was doing. Now it's absolutely a red hot key leadership competency and communication skill, which is good, and rightly so, because it is a really powerful way to connect and engage with people. Now, one of the things I often talk about is humans, we're actually hardwired to share stories. It's actually the way we communicate. It's in our DNA. And I have got no doubt that you already share stories in business. And I've got no doubt as professional communicators, you already share stories in business as well. But you're going to have a certain style. And I thought it might be useful to take you through the styles of storytelling, which you could absolutely identify where you sit, but you're probably going to identify where the vast majority of the leaders in your company sit. So your style is determined by two things, really. And the first thing is how purposeful you are with your stories. So when you're sharing your story in business, are you fully clear on what the message is you want to get across? You know the reason why you're sharing the story. Now, what I find is sometimes when I ask leaders what their message is, they can't actually articulate it. Or they go, yep, I'm really clear on the message I want to get across. I want them to understand, A, B, C, and D. Well, A, B, and C, and D is 4 messages, so you need 4 stories. So the first tip is the moment you try to cram too many messages into your story, it will lose its impact. So 1 message per story. The other thing that identifies your style is how engaging your stories are. So when you're sharing your story, are people fully engaged with you the entire time, or they've stopped listening well before you've stopped talking, which is not ideal? Now, this is a judgmental model. So what I mean by a judgmental model is we don't want to be down here. We don't want to be low engagement and low purpose. And I refer to those people as the bragger. And you've probably all been on the end of a bragger's story. They just go on and on and on forever. And there seems to be little purpose except for them to tell you how great they are. Really, you disengage quite easily when a bragger starts sharing their story. And when they finally finish their story, you have this sort of reaction, a little bit of reaction about, oh, well, good on you. Look at the time, got to go. So we don't want to be a braggart. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that you don't share stories about yourself and the good things you've done, but you've got to make sure that it doesn't have a bragger feel. I do a lot of work in Australia, and Australia has as the moment there's detecting a bit of bragger, Australian audiences turn off. I actually thought Australian audiences turned off quicker than any other audience, except I think New Zealanders turn off quicker. So Australia and New Zealand, as soon as you think people think you're bragging about yourself, they really disengage. So if you are sharing stories about the good things you've done, or the good things your company done, or the good things your team have done, just bring in humility, bring in some vulnerability, even a little bit of self-deprecating humor can drag it out of this bragger feel. The other style I see is the joker. So the joker tells really entertaining stories, love the joker's stories, but the joker misses out on this amazing business opportunity because they don't attach a key message to their story. So you remember the story, but there's actually no message to it. I do a bit of presentation training, and I often have people say to me, oh, I've always been told you should start a presentation with a funny story or a funny joke. And if it's related to your message, yes. But what I find is if it's not related, people tell a funny story and then go ahead and do their boring PowerPoint presentation. And the only thing people actually remember is the funny story, which has got nothing to do with what, the messages they want to get across. The third style I see is the reporter. So the reporter is really clear on the message they want to get across, but they tend to use a lot of facts and figures and statistics, and they bring them into the story. And the moment you start to bring too many numbers into your story, it starts to lose its engagement. So it sort of feels like a logical process where the brain starts to try to track it logically, so we lose the engagement. The reporter tends to only use business examples. Now, there's nothing wrong with business examples. And what I mean by that these are stories about things that have happened in your work, and, they can sometimes have a bit of a case study feel. So just be aware that case studies are not stories. Case studies provide really valuable information. I run a business on storytelling, and I absolutely use case studies, but they're not stories, because they're normally very logical about, this is what happened, this is what we did, these are the results, this is the outcome, this is how we measured it. Really valuable, but not stories. Or if they're stories, they have a very, very much a reporter feel. And then the final style we see, which is sort of the style we want to aspire to, is the inspirer. So the inspirer is really clear on the message they want to get across. They've got one single message they want to get across, but they tend to use a personal story to do that. So when I talk about inspire, I'm not saying that your story has to be the most amazing, inspiring, climbing Mount Everest story. But does your story connect and engage with people in a way that inspires action? So do they do something differently after they've heard your story? Do they feel something differently, or do they think something differently? So does it actually inspire action, or a mindset change, so that you really are trying to influence people? So that's sort of the style we're getting to. Now, you might be looking at this and you might be identifying where you are or where your predominant style is. And if you are, that's good. And also where do you think most people are? It'd be interesting if you could just type in the chat, if you wanted to, where you think most of us are in business. Where do you think the vast majority of people fall when you're looking at those styles? I'm going to have a drink of water now and wait for all the responses to come in. Yep, we're hearing reporter. Oh, someone has said a joker, but yeah, reporter. Yeah, technical industry, reporter, bragger. Okay, so yeah, couple of one bragger, one joker, all the rest reporters. In my experience, the vast majority of us are reporters. For the one person that said joker and the one person that said bragger, that could really depend on like your company you're working in. And yeah, Kelly, well done. When you get, someone says, when I get free reign, I'm an inspirer. I think that's a good thing. When people do get free reign, they can become an inspirer. Now, this is not to say that you don't tell inspiring stories, but the vast majority of us are reporters. Every company I've worked in, every industry I've worked in, every country I've worked in, the vast majority of us are reporters. And there's really valid reasons for that. So I think all our career, we've been told that works, personal, don't mix the two. We've been told, how many times have we been told, just give me the facts? We've been told that this reporter style is professional. This is the way we speak in business. But we know that it's actually not very engaging. So a lot of the time you still do need some of that reporter style, but when you're trying to influence people, when you're trying to get your message to stick, when you're actually trying to connect and engage with people, not just pass on information, we need to move out of that reporter style and move more to the inspirer style. So, staying reporter is relatively easy. It feels safer. You don't have to give anything of yourself. And it's sort of the way we've been told all our life that this is how we should communicate. But I want to just flip that on its head a bit and think about, yes, sometimes we still do need to use the reporter style. But like I said, if we're trying to connect with people, if we're trying to engage, if we're trying to, get people connected to values or strategy or mission or purpose, if we're doing a presentation and we just want them to remember one message, let's start thinking about how we could use personal stories to do that. I want to give you an example now of what I mean by an inspirer story, because again, I want to highlight that this isn't, the climbing Mount Everest stories. These are your day-to-day stories. It's almost the more day-to-day they are, the more powerful they can become. So let me give you an example. I was working with a client and I was working with the entire risk team. So the head of risk, her name was Rosemarie. And Rosemarie said during the workshop, she said, the biggest issue I have, the biggest communication issue I have to the business units that I support is trying to convince them that just because I'm the risk manager, it's not my job to manage their risk, that all I can do is help them manage their risk. And she said, it doesn't matter how many times I've told them that all I can do is help them and give them the advice to help them manage their own risk and can't manage their risk for them. She says nothing changes. Every time risk is raised as an issue, everyone just looks at me and go, well, you're the risk manager, that's your job. So this is the story. Her name was Rosemarie, and this is the story Rosemarie started to share. She said, when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm. And growing up on a farm, there was all these dangers we needed to be aware of, but Mum would teach us what to do. So we knew what to do if we ever came across a spider in the timber heap, and we knew about all the potential traps in the dam after heavy rain. And we knew what to do if we ever came across a snake in summer. And I remember this like stinking hot day, Mum was yelling at me to get my bike from the front gate. So I ran down the path and then I just froze, because in front of my bike was this massive copperhead snake. But I remembered everything Mum taught us to do. So I played statues and I slowly walked backwards until there was enough space between me and the snake, and I ran back to the house to tell Mum. And I'm sharing this with you because it reminds me of the role we play in risk. All I can do is give you the skills, knowledge, and advice. So when you come across your own copperhead snake, regardless of what that looks like, you will know what to do. Now, I want to ask you a couple of questions after hearing that story. Do you think that helps you understand the role of a risk manager better? You can put it in the chat if you want, or you can just nod away in silently. But do you think that actually helps you understand the role of a risk manager better? And when I run my workshops, I'm sure, yep, everyone's going, yes. Great. Do you think, so second question, do you think you will remember that story? And I can guarantee you, you will. Whenever you I've potentially just saved all your life. So whenever you come across a snake, whenever you come across a snake, you will now know what to do because you'll remember it. And Jess is going, yes, now I want to create my own for my area. Someone's going, I'm very fearful of snakes because I nearly sat on one. Yeah, don't sit on a snake. That's not good advice. But at least now you know what to do when you play statues and you walk slowly backwards, but you will remember that story. And then the final question I want to ask you, do you think you could retell that story without losing its meaning? You wouldn't do it word for word. There was no way you would do it word for word, and you don't have to do it word for word. But do you think you could retell that story without losing its meaning? And yeah, we're getting a few yeses. I would put it to you that some of your fundamental challenges in your role, if your role involves communication and influence, that your biggest challenges are when you speak, when you communicate, do they understand it? Do they really, really understand it? Can they retell it can they remember it? And can they retell it without losing its meaning? And a personal story will do that every time. Now, there's a couple of comments that come through that I just want. Someone's written, great story. I think I can retell it with the passion. And you probably can. So, and someone else has said, probably not because it's not my story. So this is not my story. I didn't come across the copperhead snake. I'm actually sharing a story about someone in my training room that used this story. So some of you ideally you want to use your own stories. Because this is a bit of a training session, I prefer to use other people's stories to show you how they've used it in business. You might not be able to share someone else's story with the same passion, and that is true, but it could still get your message across. And that's why I do encourage you to come up with your own stories. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, I wish I grew up on a farm. That would be a great story. But you might have your own version of your copperhead snake story. You know, your parents might have taught you about stranger danger, for example. So you could have your own story about that. Or it might just spark your own story. But a personal story, when you share your personal story, it's more likely people are going to help you understand the message, they're going to remember it, and they're going to retell it. One of the things I talk about when I was sharing that story about the copperhead snake, you would have pictured it. You know, you would have all pictured that story. And if I got you to, you know, if I was sitting down and said, draw what you saw, you'd all draw something completely different. A lot of people go, I could see the girl, I could see the red, the snake, I could see the red bike. And I'm thinking, I never mentioned the bike was red, but I've given you enough information that you've actually pictured it. And one of the other things that it's done, at some level, it's tapped into emotion, and that is why you'll remember it. So the brain actually processes emotion a lot differently than it does logic. So it processes it faster, and it also stores it in the long-term part of our brain. So that is why you will remember it. So at some level that is tapped into emotion. And when I say emotion, I'm not talking about emotional. I'm not talking about, you know, you have to be really scared of snakes. It's just at some level it's tapped into emotion. And yeah, Helen's written, I actually visualized the snake with a reared head and felt the fear. And again, it's tapped into emotion. So that is what a personal story does. It taps into emotion at some level, and it helps people visualize what you're doing. People will often go, when you're talking about how emotion gets stored in the long-term part of our brain, that is why sometimes we will go, you know, I know exactly where I was when I heard about 9/11 or Princess Diana dying, or anything of real significance that really touched us emotionally. We'll even remember where we were and who we were with and what we were doing, because it is stored in the long-term part of our brain. So there's a lot of talk about storytelling. So one thing I've noticed a lot of is there's certainly an increase in the use of stories, but there's also an increase in the use of people using the word story without actually sharing a story. So, oh, someone's saying we're still on slide 3. Yes, we're still on slide 3. I'll move over. So I think one of the things that would be really, I think, make good value of our time we've got together, is go through what actually makes story a story, to actually understand what makes a story. Because what I see a lot of people using the word story, but not actually sharing a story. You may have noticed a trend over the last few years on websites where the About Us page has changed to Our Story. Now, I can't help myself. Whenever I see an Our Story on a website, I get in and I have a look, and 9 times out of 10, there is no story there. So calling something a story doesn't make it a story. Recently, I bought a pair of swimwear for my husband for his birthday, and it's an Australian brand. It's called the Coral Empire, and they use recycled nylon and recycled fishing nets to make these really tailored swimwear for men. And on their website, it said Our Story, and I got in and had a look, and it was just so bland and so full of jargon. It didn't really say anything. There was no emotional connection to it. But I actually thought there must be a story around why they started this company. So I actually reached out to them because, there were a couple of Australians. This is their sort of part-time gig. One of them actually worked for NAB, so I sort of had a bit of a soft spot for them. And I said, I'm happy just to help you with your story. I could turn this into a story just by asking you a few questions. So I literally spent 15 minutes with her on the phone asking some questions. And she told me that, when she was on maternity leave with her 3rd child, she lived by the beach, and she noticed that women would look stunning in their swimwear and so many options. And the only options men had were either really, really tight, budgie smugglers, or really bad, big baggy board shorts. And there was nothing in between. And being, she sort of thought men need a more tailored, high-level swimwear, and being sustainable, she wanted to do it from, recycled stuff. And this amazing backstory that, when she was telling me, I was fully engaged and connected with. but it was not on their website. So, literally just ask some questions. And if for those of you that are working in companies and have your story, just go deeper and ask some questions, and you can actually find some stories there. So one of the things I thought could be really useful, because people are using the word story incorrectly when they say this is a story and it's not a story, it's a timeline of their company or it's a case study, is to talk about what makes a story a story. Can you share some questions? Can you share some questions to ask with us to uncover the stories among our employees? Yeah, look, so my first tip is don't ask for a story. Don't say, what's your story? Because people go, I don't have a story. With its employees, I would ask things like, why did you want to work here? What made you join here? Questions like, when was the last time you felt really proud to work here? They're going to talk about stuff. Things like, describe a time when you went home and shared with your partner what a great thing that happened at work today. Tell us a time about when one of your colleagues did something that, made a big difference to you or to someone else or to a client. So it's asking really specific questions that people will respond with a story. And if you can get heaps of stories about why people are feeling proud to work here, you pretty much uncover a company's values that way. So hopefully that helps. So the first thing for a story to be a story, there needs to be a sequence. Now, there's a sequence to a story. You probably already know it, but it's beginning, middle, and end. Now, there was Aristotle 2,500 years ago said for a story to be a story, it needs a beginning, middle, and end. It'd be fair to say that has stood the test of time, so don't mess with that sequence. Always start with the beginning, always start with the middle, and always start with an end. And because we've all been on, listen to people tell stories without an ending, and it's frustrating. You walk away going, what the hell was that about? So don't be that person that has a story with no ending. Don't be that person. The other thing is a bare minimum for a story to be a story. It needs to have a specific event. So I apologize now for all of you who said I hate snakes, but this is what a copperhead snake looks like. The thing with the specific event, without a specific event, it's not a story. They're not venomous anyway, by the way, so relax. The New Zealanders don't have to worry about it because you don't even have snakes. Without the specific event, there's no story. So if I shared Rosemarie's copperhead snake story without actually the specific event of the copperhead snake, if I had have said, when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm, and growing up on a farm, there was all these dangers we needed to be aware of, but Mum would teach us what to do. And I'm sharing this with you because it reminds me of the role we play in Risk. Can you see there's no story? There's no story, because without the specific event, you don't visualize anything. So it was only you only started to visualize that when I talked about the copperhead snake. So you don't visualize anything and you don't feel anything. And that is fundamentally what makes a story a story. You need to be able to visualize it, and you need at some level, feel something, and it's tapped into emotion. That is why case studies are not stories. Depending on how they're told, there could be a bit of a story element to it, but normally case studies are this is what the problem was, this is what we did. It's why the timeline of your company is not a story. We started here in 1920, and in 1940 we joined with whatever. Information, all it is information. It's not a story because there's no emotional connection. So for a story to be a story, it needs a beginning, middle, and end. It needs a specific event that helps the person visualize something and feel something. And I've already talked about that because the brain processes emotion quicker and stores it, it's actually the fast path to the brain. So often in business, we think because we're dealing in quite logical information that we have to communicate it in a very logical way. But the reality is the fastest way to get to the head is through the heart. So think about how you can tap into emotion to get your logical information through. And at this point, I should say that there's also research to show that if you put a picture of a brain on your PowerPoint slides, that people think you're 10% smarter than what you are. So have a few of them scattered through. That is obviously a joke for anyone if the humour didn't translate via webinar. That's a bit of a joke. So that's what makes a story a story. Now, when you share stories in business, there's some fundamental differences between sharing stories with your mates over dinner. So this is where the real skill comes in. You can't share stories in the same way that you share stories in your personal life. So let's work through a few of those, and then I might open it up for questions because you might have a few more. The first is, when you're sharing stories in business, you've got to have a purpose. Like, you've got to have a reason for doing it. You don't want to be that person that just shares these random stories and people walk out going, what the hell was that about? So be very, very clear on why you're sharing your story. You know, do you want them to understand something better? Do you want them, you know, to feel something different or to actually do something different? Or do you just want them to remember your message? Be really clear on why you're sharing your story. The other thing, it's got to be relatable. So it's got to be related to your message and relatable to your audience. What I find is the most day-to-day stories about your kids, stories about something you did on the weekend, story about your parents, story about when you were a kid, the more day-to-day they are, the more relatable they are. It doesn't matter how many times I hear a story about someone climbing the summit of Mount Everest and describing the summit, I cannot relate to it. I get it's cold. I know you can't stay up there for a long time, but I cannot relate to that because it's just not relatable for the vast majority of people. So the more day-to-day you are, the more relatable it will be. And I know we've got a couple of New Zealanders on the line, and I remember the first time I shared that copperhead snake story in New Zealand, a woman said to me, I related to that so much, and we don't even have snakes in this country. So don't think, oh, a story about, you know, a snake is only going to be relatable to someone who grew up on a farm or someone who's come across a snake. The more day-to-day they are, the more relatable they will be. And I'll tell you one thing that we all have in common, all of us have in common, is that at one time we were kids. So stories about your childhood can be really powerful and really relatable. The other mindful thing that you need to be aware of when you're sharing stories in business is that they have to be succinct. It doesn't matter how intriguing you think your story is. After a few minutes, people will be thinking, if not saying, get to the point. So I think in business, my little rule of thumb is that in business, your story should be around about 1 to 2 minutes. Now, your stories can be less than a minute, and they can probably be slightly longer than 2 minutes, but I guarantee you when they're going 2.5, 3, 4 minutes, people will be switching off and thinking get to the point. And you want to get to your point like so before they even start to switch off. So be really, really succinct. I think one of the biggest mistakes people make when sharing stories in business without being trained is that they just go on for way too long because they don't know how to start their stories really effectively. They don't have the discipline to leave things out because they're not clear on the message, and they tend to the endings tend to go on and on and on forever when people have actually got the point 2 minutes ago, but they're still feeling like they have to reinforce the message, which in the end they just, you know, sort of become very dictatorial about the message. The other thing that you need to be really mindful of, how many words in a written story? Great, thank you for that question. I should have most of that. In a written story, they need to be even more succinct. So 300 words, I think, is probably about right. You don't want a story going for 500-600 words. So I would say around 300 words feels about 300 to 400 maybe. Feels about right. I think one of the tests is if you narrate the story, so if you read it out, so once you've written and you read it out loud, just make sure it's going probably no longer than a minute and a half, I would say. So you do need to be more succinct with your written format. And stories, personal stories, absolutely work in a written format. So a lot of senior leaders are now, writing their own, emails or newsletters to their teams, especially the ones that lead larger teams. And that is the absolute spot for them to share personal stories. So, that's not the spot for project updates and all that. Yes, that can be provided, but I would always be leading with a personal story from the leader. It can be really powerful, really powerful. So another question here, do you try out the story and refine that along the way? Yes, you do, to both of those. So what I mean by try out the story, you should practice and practice and practice your story. So I always suggest you should literally, when you start doing this, write out your stories. So, type them up, have them there, you've got them. Then practice sharing them and absolutely time it. So if your story is going for 3 minutes, then cut stuff out. And it's almost when you're practicing it, when you say it in person, it's always going to be longer. It's always going to be longer because you're going to pause and stuff. I know when I prepare for presentations, if I'm preparing for a 60-minute presentation and I'm, just practicing it out loud and it's going for about 45 minutes, I know I'm actually right, because when I get to say it, I know, it will go slower. And then, yes, if you're not sure, you might want to practice it out loud with, a colleague or a trusted advisor, someone who can give you good feedback. And once you've shared it, once you've sort of done it to a team or a client or wherever you're sharing it, then just do a little bit of reflection. Did it work? How did you feel? Do you need to refine it? Did you feel it went too long? Did they ask a question about a point in your story that had nothing to do with your story? So should that have been removed? So you absolutely refine them along the way. So a couple of other things, two more other things with sharing stories in business. One is, then this is the first thing, it's got to be congruent with what you believe. And what I mean by that, and I know this is Leadership 101, your words and actions should be congruent. So if you're sharing a story about the importance of work-life balance, you can't be that person that works to midnight every night in the office. If I come and work for you and you share a story about, it's okay to make mistakes are learning opportunities, and you give me that message through a personal story, and then I come and make a mistake and you tell me and you bite my head off, it'd be like, hey, what happened to the learning opportunity? So people will remember your personal stories more than just your words. So you really have to make sure they're congruent. So congruent with your own values, but also believing in the message. This is not marketing spin. This is not, just using stories to paint a great picture of it. I did some work once with a team that were rolling out a major change, and they wanted to communicate it through stories. And when I was working with them, it just it didn't seem congruent. It just didn't feel right. And I eventually asked them, do you actually believe in this change? Because they were trying to come up with all stories about why this change was so great. And then they said, no, we don't believe it. We think it's actually going to be really disruptive for our business unit. Long term, it might be okay, but it's actually going to be really disruptive for us. But it's a global directive, and we're being told we need to support it. And I just said, well, you can support it, but maybe our story should be around, this is going to be really disruptive for us. But, maybe our story should be around, sometimes you've got to accept the umpire's decision. Maybe the stories are around, sometimes you've got to take a little bit of a hit for the greater good. So all those messages you actually believe in, but let's share stories around that. And I think one of the fundamental reasons a lot of change fails in organizations is because we start a big change sharing stories about how great it's going to be at the end, and we actually don't share stories about the real pressing needs of employees, that their anxiety and fear and stuff and disruption when it comes to change. I mean, even the people that fully support the change still might be feeling disrupted and might want to hear stories that they need support. So just make sure you actually believe in the message that you're trying to deliver. And the other thing is around authenticity. So normally when I run my workshops, I ask the question about, does a story need to be true as long as it's believable? Now, I won't even attempt to do this over the chat, because I normally spend a good 10 minutes we can get sometimes in a quiet debate. Some people will argue that if the story gets your message across and does the job, it actually doesn't matter if it's true or not, like a personal story. I would suggest that it's not worth the backlash to your credibility to make up personal stories as if they're your own. So in my opinion, your stories, they've got to be congruent with who you are, but they've always got to be true. If Rosemarie shared her personal story about the copperhead snake, and then you came across Rosemarie and you said, oh, I really love your story about the copperhead snake. I grew up on a farm too. Where did you grow up? And she said, oh, I grew up in the city. I just made that up. Where is her credibility for you? Her credibility is shot. It's a long way back from that, because can you sense, some people will go, but it's just a little white lie. Can you sense it's actually worse than a lie? That it's a betrayal of trust. And that's what it is, because people feel that you tried to deliberately, emotionally manipulate me and I fell for it. So it actually becomes a betrayal of trust. And we are living in a decline of trust where, trust is at its lowest point with, alternative facts and fake news and royal commissions. We don't know who to trust or what to trust. And it's just not worth the backlash on your credibility to make up stories or to spin them so much that they're actually not true. Now, there always may be some little bit of poetic license, but when you tell your own personal story, you don't just retell it, you actually relive it, and you can't help but relive it. So I think when it's a made up story or when it's stretched too far, that people sense it. They just can see something that just doesn't seem right, and that's because you're not reliving it. You're actually you're just telling it if it's made up. So absolutely make sure your stories are authentic. Your life is rich in stories. So it is so much easier just to find a story to match your message than try to make something up. And it's probably one of the main points I would stress in this whole session on storytelling. And finally, I want to end on a little bit of thing on this. It's have you heard of the curse of knowledge? You may have heard about it, but the curse of knowledge is when you know your stuff really well and you're communicating it to the people that you think, well, they should get this. It's really logical, but they just don't. This is when a story can really help. So, for example, Rosemarie was trying to communicate the role of a risk manager, and she just felt like she was hitting her head up against a brick wall all the time because she was using logic to do that. So she shared a story to actually get the message across. So it absolutely changed the way they did. Rosemarie told me later that at the end of the meeting, the business units would go, have we identified all our copperhead snakes? So that really helped her dodge the curse of knowledge. One of the other things I quickly want to talk about too is another way to dodge the curse of knowledge is just to reduce the amount of jargon and acronyms that we use. And your role, I think you guys in your role as professional communicators play such a critical role on removing unnecessary acronyms. We are addicted to reducing everything to an acronym and being very clear of what the jargon is, because if everyone understands it, if everyone understands the jargon and the acronym, then all good. It can become an efficient way to do it. But we know that's not the case. We know, it's not the case, especially with acronyms that have multiple meanings. And the real danger is when we start talking to clients or customers or people outside the industry from different departments in our company using industry-specific jargon and acronyms that they don't understand. So it actually leads to miscommunication. For some of you who know my work, you'll probably know that I'm the founder of Jargon Free Fridays, and today being Friday, I thought we'd be good to show one of the videos. It's a bit of a fun way to raise awareness to what I think is actually a pretty serious problem in business, because I truly believe that if we spoke the way we did in business in any other aspect of our life, we would call it out for how ridiculous it is. So if you want to know more, head to Jargon Free Fridays, but I'm just going to show you one of the videos to highlight this point.
Mummy, Daddy, where do babies come from?
Well, sweetie, when Mummy and Daddy synergise with each other very, very much, Mummy grants Daddy an open door policy in order to further enhance the possibility of cross-cultural pollination.
Mummy and Daddy remove from their structures any moratoriums which would otherwise prevent an inadvertent merger, and they diarise summits as often as commercially possible.
Yeah, of course, there are a matrix of factors which determine the extent to which these summits can be determined to be a success.
Oh, yes. Actually, I could not agree more. In many cases, the KPI of Mummy's edification is often removed altogether in a unilateral management decision characterised as the cost of doing business, despite brand promises to the contrary.
Well, the costs associated with summits aren't a two-way street, sweetie. Of course, Dad did have to give up cycling, even though his reserves were optimal. They were optimal.
If the summit is successful in relation to the procreational core objective, within 9 calendar months, you can expect a yield of at least 1 baby.
I thought you just had 6.
If you are sick of the way we talk business and want to communicate in a way that's more genuine, then join me. Head to jargonfreefridays.com and invite your colleagues to do the same. It's time to get real.
So people are going, love it, love it, love it. There's a few other really, really cool videos if you want to, just introduce it to your company, and you'll be the savior. There's a couple of other videos if you go to Jargon Free Fridays. I think my favourite is if marriage proposals were in corporate jargon. So I just want to end on this. I'm not suggesting that you need a story for everything. This is the great Aristotle here, and Aristotle said that when you are trying to influence people, that you need 3 things. You need logos, ethos, and pathos. And logos is logic. So you absolutely need sound logic when you're trying to influence people. Ethos is personal credibility, and pathos is emotional connection. And when you're trying to influence people, Aristotle said you need all 3. Now, the 2 most critical aspects of that, logic, personal credibility, and emotional connection when you're trying to influence people, is ethos and pathos. Personal credibility and emotional connection are the 2 most critical bits. But in business, where do we spend the vast majority of our time? It's through logic. We absolutely spend it on logic. So sometimes in your role, all you need to do is provide logic. All you need to do is inform people. So just inform people. Just use logic. You don't need a story for that. I often say, if someone says, what's the latest monthly sales figures? You don't go, oh, that reminds me of a time when. You just inform people. If you're doing a project status update, you're just informing people. So you use logic. But if you are trying to influence people, then you got to use story to tap into ethos and pathos. If you want your message to be remembered and to be really sticky, think about how you can use a story. If you're anticipating the curse of knowledge or experiencing that curse of knowledge, that feeling where you think you're hitting your head up against a brick wall and why don't they get it because it's so logical, think of a story about how you can do that. So it's not about sharing stories for everything, but it's sharing stories strategically, and especially when you're trying to influence people. So Helen has said my first language is Greek, and I'm loving this. Yes, we love the Greeks. They gave us some good stuff. So, there we go. So I'm going to open it up. So that's a way you can connect and with me and everything. But while you're just taking in that, and you can actually subscribe and get the 7-day storytelling starter kit as well. But this is the time for any questions. So fire away. We've got about another 6 or 7 minutes before Zora wraps again. So if you've got any questions, just put them in there and I will see what I can do over the next time together we have. There's been some good questions throughout, so that's been good. You may have got everything you needed and not have any other questions. And until I get a question, I'll just keep talking about all my books that are in front of you. I won't. My latest book, see the one with the photo of me? That's my latest book that came out a couple of weeks ago. IABC Victoria had the very world event special launch about 6 weeks ago before it was even launched, which was very nice. But yeah, if you are looking for resources, Stories for Work is purely a book on storytelling, which is my latest book if you want that. But Real Communication, How to Be You and Lead True is a more general one around why we need stories now more than ever. So there's a couple of comments coming through, questions. This was great, thank you. How do you convince leaders who are hesitant to share personal stories? Yeah, look, there are going to be some leaders who are hesitant. Quite selfishly, I think one of the best ways is bring me in and I run workshops for them. But I even know when I run my workshops, there's some people in the room that are still hesitant. But what I know is once they are in that workshop and they experience the power of it, that's when they can just get on board. I think it's also convincing them that this isn't about sharing their deepest, darkest fears and secrets. And it's not about, being vulnerable and overly emotional. It's just sharing day-to-day stories that can really work. How do you help someone land the right story? Question prompting, key messages, focus. Okay. Start with the message. Be really, really clear on the message. What is it they want to get across? And then sort of go, how does this feel outside of work? So say their message is around teamwork. How does this feel outside of work? Avoid sports stuff if you can. Or say if this is about, not letting people down, doing the right thing, just keep going, how does this feel outside of work? The more, if you're working with leaders and you get to know them quite well, that's when you can play a role of prompting them to say, hey, you should share that story you told me about your wife the other day, or about your son, or, your mum, or whatever. Next question. What's your thoughts on leaders showing vulnerability in written stories on the intranet? I think vulnerability is one of the most powerful things a leader can show. And I think it works just as well in the written format as the verbal format. You don't want it to be showing vulnerability just to be vulnerable, because I think that's when people feel they're being manipulated. But if it just happens naturally, then I think that's okay. And not more than okay. I think it's good. And leaders will step into this to their own comfort. So what I wouldn't do, if you're working with a leader who is really uncomfortable sharing a vulnerable story, don't push them to do it. Don't push them to do it, because they will do it and it probably will not be a great experience, and then they will never step into it again. So as the storyteller, they decide, and they alone decide what stories to share and with whom. So don't push them too much for vulnerability. Next question. What are your first action steps you take when digging for hidden stories in a company? I actually run I can come into companies and run sessions that, like story harvesting and story finding sessions, where you bring people from all over, not just management, but almost deliberately from the front line, and get them in a room and ask some of those specific questions that I said before, like, describe a time you felt really proud to work here, share an example of when a colleague's done something that's made a great difference to you or a team. So if you have a handful of those questions, what it does, someone will share a story, and then what happens when people share stories, it sparks another story, and people go, oh yeah, I remember doing this. So that's the way I go in and find. You got to have your radar up. You sort of got to know when to dig deep. I often describe, I'm a little bit like, when you see those metal detectors, people with metal detectors, and they go along the beach and they're looking for metal. I can do the same, but with story, because the stories are there. The stories are there, but they're always hidden below the surface, and you've got to know where and when to dig a bit deeper. And we've got one last question. Can you give examples of some impressive storytellers in business and politics today? Well, timely, Bob Hawke, Bob Hawke, the former Prime Minister, I think he was very good at sharing stories. It's in business, there's a few. Andrew Thorburn, who worked at NAB, was a very, very good storyteller. So he would, if you ever have seen him speak, he shares stories. Alan Joyce, if you ever fly Qantas and you look at the editor's thing, he often has stories in there, and some are work related, but they're still stories. In politics, there's so much room for politics. I've actually written an article, though, for any of you following the Australian election. It's the story that changed the election, and it's the only time, through all the one-liners, through all the scripting, when Bill Shorten shared the story about his mother, it was the only time there was a real engagement and connection, because he actually came across as human. And then when he was attacked by the Murdoch press the next day, it even gave him a greater opportunity to be more human, when he actually got quite emotional defending his mother. And we will look back on this election in a year's time or 5 years' time, and the only thing people will remember from the 6 weeks of relentless campaigning is the story he shared about his mother and his emotional response to it. So I'm not saying he's great I'm putting him up as a great storyteller, but I'm highlighting the point of one story, and that's what we'll remember. And there has been one final one. This has got to be the final one, because I've got to give Zora some time to close off. When interviewing someone for a story, is it better approaching them over the phone or by sending key questions by mail? I would always prefer to be speaking to someone, because the reality is, if it's just a written questions over email, they will provide the answer and they'll probably be very scripted and they'll review it. But when you're interviewing someone, and I do this with my podcast, my Authentic Leadership podcast, where I interview CEOs. And by the way, if you can recommend anyone, if you work with a great authentic leader, real communicator, let me know, and I'll love to interview them for my CEO podcast. But when you're speaking to someone individually, that's when you can go, I think there's something more here. And you can literally go, so tell me more about that. And how did you feel when that happened? And that's when people dig down, and you actually get the real gold if you can dig deeper with follow-up questions, which is very hard to do in an email. So good question, Jane, to finish on. Well, I think that's it, Zora. I think I can hand it over to you, and hope you all found it useful, and get connected.
Good. Thank you, Gabrielle. That was, every time I hear you talk about storytelling, I always get something new out of it. So even though I've heard the Copperhead story a few times, but every time I still go, yep, that's perfect illustration. So thanks for sharing your wisdom with us today. I am sure everyone else also got lots of information there, and will be taking that on board, taking it back to their workplaces and personal lives as well. So I just wanted to quickly wrap up with regards to IABC. Next week, we're involved in the Corporate Affairs Summit in Sydney. So you can follow that on Twitter through CASUMMIT, so CAS Summit, 21st and 22nd of May, for anything regarding reputation, issues management and corporate affairs. And of course, follow the IABC 19 hashtag for the World Conference from the 9th to the 12th of June in Vancouver, where a number of us will be from across Asia Pacific, some presenting and others participating. The other thing is, we will be running another free webinar in the next 5 to 6 weeks. So please look out for that, and we'll confirm the details of that coming up soon. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and look forward to talking with you again in a few weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you, everyone.
Thank you.